اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان. ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم وإن تطيعوا الله ورسوله لا يلتكم من أعمالكم شيئا إن الله غفور رحيم. إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ثم لم يرتابوا وجاهدوا بأموالهم إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ثم لم يرتابوا وجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم وأنفسهم في سبيل الله أولئك هم الصادقون. قل أتعلمون الله بدينكم والله يعلم ما في السماوات وما في الأرض والله بكل شيء عليم. يمنون عليك أن أسلموا قل لا تمنوا علي إسلامكم يمنون عليك أن أسلموا قل لا تمنوا علي إسلامكم بل الله يمن عليكم أن هداكم للإيمان بل الله يمن عليكم أن هداكم للإيمان إن كنتم صادقين. إن الله يعلم غيب السماوات والأرض والله بصير بما تعملون. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنا أعطيناك الكوثر. إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih. Wa afdalu salati wa atammu taslim. Ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina wa habibina wa uswatina Muhammadan wa ala alih. Alladhina adabullahu anhum rijsa wa taharrufum tatira. ورضوان الله تعالى على صحابته الراشدين المباركين والتابعين لهم بخير وإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وأما بعد. So firstly, let me thank the organizers for this beautiful program that we have that coincides actually in America with February being Black History Month. And also this coincides with the date in which Malcolm X, rahmatullahi alayhi, or at least the month of his shahada in which he was martyred on February 21st, the year 1965, Common Era. So we see that there is an alignment with your discussion across the pond with this very influential figure. Dare I say, he is the most influential African-American Muslim in the history of Islamic civilization. Malik al-Shabazz, al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. So what I will be doing is bringing up some slide and giving you a brief presentation on some thoughts as kind of to give a little background about our beloved Malcolm. And by the way, my new book that's coming out called Blackness in Islam is not related to Malcolm, but I figured I would pick the title for that new book and relate it to this talk simply because in the imagination of many people in the West that Malcolm X has been de-Islamicized. So at least in the American context, we see that the Pan-Africanists celebrate Malcolm X's life as a Pan-Africanist. And we see middle-class African Americans who are involved in respectability politics, they will celebrate Malcolm X as a civil rights leader in America. And then we will even see Marxists that will celebrate the life of Malcolm X, seeing him as a type of quasi-Marxist revolutionary. And I've heard this from the authority of Sheikh Zaid Shakir, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, who's in America, who heard from Malcolm's wife, the late Dr. Betty Shabazz, rahmatullahi alayha, who made a comment to him that said, the Black nationalists claim my husband and the Marxists claim my husband. When are the Muslims going to step up and take rightful ownership of my husband and my husband's legacy? So this is the framework that I'm coming from when we're talking about Blackness in Islam in light of Malcolm X, his biography, but actually even going beyond his biography. So let us begin. Bismillah. So our brother touched on some of Malcolm's background. And I think it's very important for us to understand his parents, because people just don't pop out of nowhere. They're not born in a historical vacuum. And when we have consequential people in history, that we should look to their upbringing, look to their parents to see the type of influence that they had on that individual's development. So we have the issue here of Malcolm and Malcolm's parents. Both Malcolm's parents, as was mentioned earlier, Earl Little and Louise Little, were part of a Pan-African organization known as the United Negro Improvement Association that was started by a Jamaican immigrant. He actually lived in the UK for a while before coming to America, by the name of Marcus Garvey, who was the leader of the UNIA, which led up a very large organization at the time that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, of trying to unify Black people throughout the diaspora. And keep in mind that during this time period, this is prior to African nations gaining their liberation from neocolonialism. So for instance, Ghana, which is the first country that got its sovereignty, so to speak, from a European colonial power, the British, Ghana was not an independent nation state at this particular time. Right, it was under the colonialization of the British. Right, so this is the time period or the frame. While Marcus Garvey was in the UK, and he was working on a newspaper that could be distributed throughout those from the African diaspora, seeking to unify oppressed people based upon their common identity, which was Blackness, and against their common oppressor, which was Europeans, that he came into contact and became befriended and a colleague of a Muslim. This Muslim was born in Alexandria, Egypt. One of his parents, his father, was Egyptian. His mother was from Sudan. And he's known as Duse Muhammad Ali. Duse Muhammad Ali. So they were in discussion about this organizing. And what is lost upon many people, or who don't understand the history of the UNIA, is that when the UNIA was organizing itself, they had a discussion about what was going to be the official religion of the UNIA. And there were two basic religions that were put up, Christianity and Islam. And Christianity became the official religion of the UNIA, but there was respect for Muslims. And the slogan of the UNIA, one aim, one God, one destiny, is from a direct result and an influence from this Muslim Duse Muhammad Ali, right? So when we're talking about a movement that Malcolm X's parents were in, they were well familiar that the states or the territories that were struggling for their liberation from the false ideology of white supremacy and neocolonialism, that They saw their brethren not just as Christians, but also Muslims in the struggle. So this is a very important point. Now, also, this man, Duse Muhammad Ali, when Garvey came here to the States, he also came to the States, but he came to the city of my birth and where I live at, Detroit, Michigan, in around the year 1918. He established something called the Universal Islamic Association in the city of Detroit. Then he began to preach Islam to African American people, giving dawah in the east side of Detroit around this time period. And keep in mind that when Malcolm was born from his parents in Omaha, Nebraska, and they were chased out of Omaha, Nebraska by the Ku Klux Klan, where did they settle? They settled in the same state of Michigan, where Duse Muhammad Ali came to. And when Earl Little was a preacher, preaching in Lansing, he used to make trips regularly to the city of Detroit, and he would come to the same neighborhood in the same area where Duse Muhammad Ali, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, was giving dawah to Black people. So this is the environment, or this is the lineage to help birth Malcolm. And so I try to look at the connections of these things. I don't look at these things of just being circumstantial, that this all plays into the language environment and to the sensitizing that Black people had in the city of Detroit, Malcolm's family. And then eventually when Malcolm gets out of prison, and the first place he comes to, which I will get to later, he comes to the city of Detroit. This is the first place that he actually preached in, was the city of Detroit. Now, how did Malcolm get introduced to Islam? Now, the Nation of Islam, Dr. Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, who wrote a book called Islam and the Black American, I suggest you all read it. He labels the Nation of Islam of what he calls a proto-Islamic movement. So we wouldn't say that the Nation of Islam falls underneath what we understand as Orthodox Aqidah, Orthodox Creed. He calls it a proto-Islamic movement, meaning that there wasn't a large population of Muslims in the United States of America that were giving dawah or inviting African American people to what we would consider normative Islam. But the Nation of Islam was an organization that started before traditional dawah in Islam, thus it is called proto-Islamic. And Imam Suraj Wahaj, who was a prominent African-American da'iyah in New York City, he described the Nation of Islam, which he used to be a part of, was a bridge for African Americans to come towards the Quran and to the Sunnah of our beloved Prophet Muhammad salawatullahi wasalamuhu alayhi wa ala ali. So who introduced Malcolm was his two brothers. So you see on the left is his eldest brother by the name of Wilford, and then you see on the right his younger brother by the name of Filbert. Both of them eventually also become ministers in the Nation of Islam. After Malcolm X had gotten himself into legal trouble while he was living with his sister Ella Collins, and his sister Ella Collins, they shared the same father but had a different mother, because Malcolm's father had been married before down south in Georgia before he married Louise Little. So that's not in the book about his previous wife, but the book does, as you will see, it mentions his sister Ella, and Ella became a Muslim and made Hajj and all of those things later on. When he got in trouble living with his sister after leaving Michigan, then going to Boston, then living for a short time in Harlem, New York, then he got in legal trouble in Massachusetts, and he got imprisoned, and his brothers were the one who introduced him to the teachings of Mr. Elijah Muhammad. So when you watch Spike Lee's movie about the life of Malcolm X, understand that this is a type of historical fiction. So there are a number of characters in there who are fake, right? So for instance, there is a character in that movie of Malcolm X by the name of Brother Baines, and it shows Brother Baines supposedly who's the one who introduces Malcolm to the teachings of the Nation of Islam. That character, Brother Baines, is an amalgamation of different people in real life. There was no Brother Baines who was in prison, who invited and taught a Nation of Islam dogma to Malcolm X. This is a fake character. His brothers were the ones. So this is the first taste that that Malcolm had to Islam, in which he had nothing but time on his hands to read. He read he wrote the dictionary from cover to cover, from beginning with the word aardvark going all the way to the last letter of the word English alphabet and Z. He read history, philosophy, books about Islam, the Bible all the way through, and also his first reading of the Quran were actually when he was in prison and when he adopted the Nation of Islam proto-Islamic Aqidah. Now, when we look at Malcolm, and we're talking about blackness in Islam, one of the largest influences on Malcolm's Islamic development and him leaving the Nation of Islam dogma, coming to what we would consider to be normative Islam, was his interactions with Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace Muhammad. Now, Elijah Muhammad had a number of sons and a number of daughters. 3 of them were more studious in regards to their studies. Now, what is not known to many people is that in Detroit, where the Nation of Islam started, and then when their office moved to Chicago, their headquarters, when Elijah Muhammad fled the Nation of Islam because there was a power struggle in 1934 about who would take on the leadership of the organization, is that Elijah Muhammad at his temples in Detroit and Chicago had instructors teaching the Arabic language, actually who were Arabs. This is number 1. Number 2, there actually was a prayer book called the Muslim Prayer Book, in which they were being taught how to make khamsa salawat, or the 5 daily prayers, according to what we would know. And I've looked at the book in my studies of comparative fiqh. It basically was a book of how to make fiqh according to madhab Hanafi. Okay, this was being taught, and Wallace grew up learning Arabic at a young age, learning and studying Arabic poetry, reading the Quran in the Arabic language. Also, Elijah Muhammad had 2 other children who he sent to Egypt and also studied at Al-Azhar University. One of his sons and one of his daughters both went to Al-Azhar University. One of them actually got their PhD and taught in university before he passed away. They also left the teachings of the nation. So Wallace always had a problem with Nation of Islam dogma, in part because he was learning Arabic, reading the Quran for himself, and came into contact with what we would know to be mainstream Muslims, unlike some of the other members of the Nation of Islam. He had private tutelage, him being one of the sons of Mr. Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm says in his autobiography that of all of Elijah Muhammad's children, that Wallace was the most spiritual. And Wallace got kicked out of the nation many times. He actually got kicked out of the nation before Malcolm. Wallace was the one that told Malcolm, after Malcolm approached him, that Mr. Elijah Muhammad ended up having children by his secretaries, women that were, that he had children beyond his first wife, Sister Claire Muhammad. Okay, so they were close. So Malcolm says in the book that Wallace is the most spiritual. He would go to Wallace and ask questions beyond political issues. And if you can go on YouTube and you can see that there's a rally at Harlem in August 1959, you can listen to it. So on YouTube, I heard it years ago. Actually, I listened to it again this morning just out of nostalgia, because the first time I heard it was probably over around 20 years ago. Elijah Muhammad could not make it to Harlem, so Wallace came in his place, and Malcolm introduced him and said that Wallace is teaching the spiritual side of Islam, is what he said. And then Wallace starts off the meeting reciting Surah Al-Fatiha, and then Salah Ibrahimiyya, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim. So he starts off, and then he ends up giving like a type of tafsir of the meaning of that which he recited. This is back in 1959, and this was partly through the influence of Wallace that had Malcolm question actually the teachings of the Nation of Islam about Mr. Farad Muhammad, or W.F. Muhammad, being Allah in the person, which is it's still the Aqidah of the Nation of Islam to this day. They say that God came in the person to Detroit, Michigan. They say a man who came from Mecca, and more accurate that he was a Desi or South Asian, not an Arab, who came to the city of Detroit, and he came in the year 1930, and then they say he departed in the year 1934, Allah in the person, and they called him Elijah Muhammad, the messenger of God, and that all white people are shayateen or devils by nature, which of course we know all three of these things clearly contradict the clear teachings of the Quran. There's nothing ambiguous about that. So again, we need, this is part of the influence when we're talking about Blackness in Islam and looking at Malcolm as an Islamic figure. Then we have to look at the life of Wallace Muhammad. Something about Wallace that when Elijah Muhammad passed away in February, I believe it was February the 27th, 1975, that Wallace inherited the leadership of the Nation of Islam, and then he moved his followers away within that year from Nation of Islam dogma to what we would call normative Islam, and he changed his name from Wallace to Warith ad-Din. Warith ad-Din means the inheritor of the deen, or the inheritor of the religion, because he inherited the leadership of the Nation of Islam, and Allah used him as a means to help guide the largest conversion of people to normative Islam in the history of America. When he changed those teachings, there's about 250,000 people who left the belief that God came in the person of a man, that all white people are devils, and that there is no literal Yom Qiyamah, or day of resurrection. He took a group of people within about a year time period and brought them to proper Tawheed and proper Aqidah and Yom Qiyamah, and began to allow and say that it was fine for white people or any people to come to the Nation of Islam, a masajid, which he then changed all of their names. And Louis Farrakhan resurrected the old teachings back in 1979. So now, post-Hajj Malcolm, and I want to mention this, that post-Hajj Malcolm was not post-racial. So some Muslims, at least in the States, they talk about Malcolm as if, you know, he was teaching black supremacy, and he made Hajj, and then after he made Hajj, then that was basically the post-racial Malcolm, and you know, his primary concern wasn't black people and you know, kumbaya. That's far from the case. The man that you see with the imama next to Malcolm, wearing the burda, the abaya with the thobe, is Sheikh Ahmed Hassoun rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, who was from Sudan, who became Malcolm's murabbi, or Malcolm's spiritual guide, or his murshid, upon returning from Hajj. Now, when Malcolm returned from Hajj, and he had left the Nation of Islam, there are two things that he did, specifically in the States. The first thing was he established Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and the second was he established an organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was patterned after the Organization of African Unity, in which the African countries and new burgeoning nation states that were gaining their independence from the British, from the French, from the Belgium, from the Portuguese, had come together for the sake of unity, and to see how they could cooperate, not only politically, but also economically and culturally. So this is a very important point, because before Malcolm was talking about establishing a Pan-African identity and political unity amongst Black people in the West, predominantly in America, Canada, as well as in the Caribbean, his first order of business was to establish Muslim Mosque Incorporated, to establish a masjid, to teach people normative Islam, those people who left the Nation of Islam with him, and to call Black people in New York City and Harlem in particular, who were interested in knowing more about real Islam, to have a platform for that type of dawah, and again, also for the tarbiyah that I mentioned before. This is a very important point. Then Organization of Afro-American Unity was established afterwards. When Malcolm had made Hajj, but he had also had traveled across the globe, and he was seen as being a de facto ambassador for African American people. So in America, and we have these two great figures that lived at the same time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. In the domestic context, Dr. Martin Luther King had more impact within the continental United States than Malcolm X at that time. However, globally, we're talking about the global impact, then without a shadow of a doubt, Malcolm X had more global influence, in part because he was Muslim, but he had far more global influence than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did around this time of 1964 and 1965. So Malcolm met with the heads of burgeoning African states. He met with Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first leader of Ghana. He met with Jamal Abdel Nasser, who at the time was the head of Egypt. So he had a chair while all these other African heads of states had chairs. Then on the invitation of Jamal, or Egyptians say Gamal, Abdel Nasser, he was invited to Egypt, and Malcolm did an intensive, or a dawah intensive, at Al-Azhar University, where he stayed in Egypt, and he was the personal guest and was being mentored by, at the time, of the renowned Sheikh al-Azhar Mahmoud Shaltut rahmatullahi ta'ala, who's also the um, the Sheikh al-Azhar who gave that fatwa to the Sunni world that said that Madhab Imami and also Madhab Zaidi were also within the proper fold of Islam, and should be recognized as legitimate madhahib. And that came about through his interaction and dialogue with a sheikh who was also in Michigan by the name of Sheikh Muhammad Jawad Shirri, rahmatullahi ta'ala, who was a sheikh who immigrated from southern Lebanon here to the city of Detroit and established the Islamic Center of America, which was his successor after he passed away, was Sheikh Muhammad Ali Ilahi. And then after Sheikh Muhammad Ali Ilahi, who immigrated from Iran, was then Samahat Sayyid Hassan al-Qazwini. May Allah preserve them both. So this is post Hajj Malcolm, who was meeting with all these world leaders, Islamic leaders. But when he came back to America, his discourse was still about how to get Black people free from oppression of white folks, right? How to challenge the systemic forms of white supremacy that played themselves out socially and politically in the United States of America. And as a matter of fact, on the day of his martyrdom, on February 21st, 1965, it was his plan to present the entire platform and the goals that the Organization of Afro-American Unity was seeking to accomplish through his leadership, but also with his discussions with other Black leaders that he had had. He had met with the deputy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had met with James Farmer, who was leader of CORE, and the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Malcolm had met prior to his martyrdom with basically the leaders, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. He had met with the leaders, the who's who of those who were involved in the civil rights struggle. And Malcolm was putting out a platform through the Organization of Afro-American Unity about Black liberation, working in conjunction with some of these Black leaders here, but also with Black leaders and Arab leaders abroad that he had met with. And by the way, Malcolm had also visited Lebanon. He also had visited Gaza. By the way, may Allah Azza wa Jal help our brothers and sisters in Gaza who are suffering from illegal occupation. So that's kind of what I want to bring to the fore, brothers and sisters in Islam. I don't have much more to share, but I think that this history is very important as you continue reading about Malcolm, that his development within his Islam. But it's very important that when we read Malcolm and look at his history, that we should not try to make Malcolm into some sort of post-racial figure. From the beginning of his career at the Nation of Islam to the day of his martyrdom, his number one issue was addressing Black suffering and countering white supremacy. That was always his number one issue. Yeah, he was interested in the dawah of Islam, there's no doubt about it. But his number one issue was challenging the false ideology of white supremacy, and in particular, how that marginalized his people in North America as well as the Caribbean. Of course, his mother was from the Caribbean, was from the island of Grenada, so he has that Caribbean connection as well. Well, afwan minkum, I will stop there and take any questions. Okay, very good question. Well, Allah, who Azza wa Jal, told us that the variations of the night and the day, and in your Languages and skin colors are signs for those who have knowledge. So Allah gave us different skin colors, different hair textures, and this is from his signs. And I would say that we shouldn't place too much, we shouldn't overly emphasize skin color. At the same time, I don't believe in the notion of color blindness, because what color blindness does is that, let's say we're all Muslims, so forget about skin color, forget about culture. Then what happens is that in certain spaces, those who are dominant will inevitably have people inclined towards their norms, right? And I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen in the Muslim community. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلًا لِتَعَارَفُوا. He made us different nations and tribes. And these words, shu'ub and qaba'il, or in singular, shab and qabila. If we look in our tafsir of the Quran, we'll see that overwhelmingly this is related to ansab or nasab, like our lineage, right? Allah is the one who made us with the capacity to have these different cultural identities, right? In order that we may get to know one another, that in order we get to know them, not to just act like they're irrelevant or to erase them, right? So they do have, there is value in seeing this. And then, but of course we know that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, he said, لا فضل العربيين على العجمي ولا العجمين على العربي ولا الأحمر على الأسود ولا أسود على الأحمر إلا بالتقوى, right? That the Arab doesn't have virtue over the non-Arab and vice versa, and the white doesn't have virtue over the black. Literally, Ahmar is red, but the white doesn't have virtue over the black, accepting God consciousness. But who knows truly who has the most taqwa? It's Allah. We can't see that, right? We can't see anyone's taqwa. So we even have to be careful about how we judge people or judge different cultures based upon outward appearance. We have to be very cautious about that, right? And I will just end with this last hadith of our Prophet, salawatullahi wasalamuhu alayhi wa ala alih, where he said, "El-Islamu alaniya wa imanu fil qalb wa taqwaha huna, wa taqwaha huna, wa taqwaha huna." Right? So he said that Islam is public, it's open. Now we can look at people by their names or how they dress, especially sisters wearing hijab. We can see who a Muslim is, but iman is in the heart. And then its taqwa is deep down, it's huna, right? So this is a sir, this is a secret. So we can't judge people by how much taqwa someone really has. But sorry for the long answer, but Allah says in the Quran, وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ الْخَيْرُ, right? So taqwa is the best dress. But our cultures and how we look, this is also part of our dress too, right? And Allah gave us this by our decree, and we should be able to appreciate it, and see the beauty, right, in all of what God created, right? So it becomes problematic when we don't see the beauty in what God created, what Allah Azza wa Jalla created, and we end up looking at someone else's skin color as being more beautiful or more superior. And unfortunately, we even have some Islamic scholars who've made some unfortunate comments and written some things in books over the years that unfortunately they try to use their color preferences to actually say that God made one skin color or one group of people more beautiful than another, and that's quite unfortunate. Okay, well, we can call him Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. I think in the broader society, they don't know him by that. And in my talks, I use that interchangeably. But no, I think that we should not only call him more by the name that he adopted, but I think we should strengthen our spiritual connection towards him. That's why I told the organizers before the starting of the program. Here in Detroit, we started about 10 years ago. Every February 21st, we have a gathering, a majlis for Malcolm X, and we read Yasin uh, on his behalf, and we give there's poetry that people have written in English, and using his name El Hajj Malik Shabazz, and and we give reminders or talks about aspects of his life. So we've made it an annual sort of occasion. So I think how we reclaim Malcolm, especially his importance in the West, is, you know, we set aside an annual time in which we actually remember him. Allah knows best, but this is my opinion. So the Nation of Islam started in the city of Detroit. In the year 1930, a man going by the name of Fard Muhammad began to go door to door in the east side of Detroit, selling silk and costume jewelry, knocking on doors. And he invited people to something that he started that was called the Nation of Islam. And he told the Black people that this is the Islam is the religion of your ancestors that were brought here and stolen from Africa. And then he said that the names that you carry are not your authentic names. They're the names of the slave masters who owned your family. So then he called them to meeting areas. And I mean, a lot of what he said actually was true. It wasn't false. Sister Clara heard the teachings first and got excited about the teachings, and she hoped that if her husband heard these teachings, they would help her husband out. And the reason is that her husband, Elijah Muhammad, was a drunkard, right? So Farrar Muhammad came to Elijah Muhammad's home. Actually, it's in Hamtramck, Michigan. And they invited him in, and Elijah liked what Farrar was saying. And then Elijah, being unemployed, only had a few coins on him, but he gave all of his coins that he had as a donation to Farrar Muhammad, and he was interested in joining. So at that point, Farrar named Elijah Muhammad Elijah Kareem, right? And he called him Kareem because of he was generous in giving the little bit of money that he had, and that's what Kareem means in Arabic, right? So after this, Elijah Muhammad starts to be active. Farrar leaves in 1934, and then there began to be a struggle over power, including one of Elijah Muhammad's brothers by the name of Khalid. Now, what was the struggle over? Part of what the struggle was over is that they said that Elijah Muhammad was changing the teachings of Mr. Farrar Muhammad. Because I've spoken to people, I've been blessed in my lifetime to actually met people who met Farrar Muhammad and joined at that time. And they've all since now deceased. And they said that Farrar Muhammad never called himself Allah. So we can say this is a bid'ah of Elijah Muhammad, because if he's the teacher, if he's a student of Farrar Muhammad, and Farrar Muhammad is Allah in the person, then this gave him the claim of saying, well, he's the messenger of Allah. Why? Because he's carrying the risala, the message of Mr. Farrar. You understand what I'm saying? So, and then these are when some of these other teachings started coming in, like the white man's the devil. This actually was a teaching of an organization called the Moorish Science Temple, started by a man by the name of Noble Drew Ali, that preceded or came before the Nation of Islam, another proto-Islamic movement. He was a African-American guy who he was in a traveling circus and went to Morocco and came into contact with some Sufis, and then he borrowed some stuff from them, and then he came back and started a new religion called the Moorish Science Temple. It still exists in America, by the way, including in my city. There's a Moorish Science temple. They wear the tarbush and they face towards Mecca, but they don't make the ruku and sujood. They have a dua kind of like the Aga Khani Ismailis do, where they face towards Mecca and make a dua like 2 or 3 times a day, like I think 2 times a day the Aga Khanis do, like 2 times a day. Like I think it's at Fajr and Maghrib they have their dua. So this is where the Nation of Islam Aqidah started. In America, actually very few people who are African Americans who identify as Muslim follow the Nation of Islam. Like very few, a very small percentage. Minister Louis Farrakhan is known to be a charismatic African American leader, but most of the people that follow him or his acolytes, they don't claim to be Muslim. Most of them are nominal Christians or Pan-Africanists. They're not Muslims. Like at the Million Man March he had over 20 years ago, about 25 years ago, I think, most of those people that showed up, like very few of them were Muslim out of those million people. In regards to Elijah Muhammad, why do some people still believe that he's Rasulullah? I mean, it's the same reason why I guess some people think that Isa alayhi salam is a white man who was the son of God with blonde hair and blue eyes. I mean, people believe different things. You know, I mean, I don't have any further explanation than that. People believe all sorts of things that are bottled. I try to avoid answering questions like that. It'd be presumptuous for me to try to say where he was going. I can just say that where he was at, his vision got expanded greatly after Hajj and also meeting with world leaders. And I think that's why certain forces believe that he had to be murdered, because he internationalized the issue. And I would say, though, that I think it's a mistake for people to blame the Nation of Islam for his martyrdom. It was a much bigger conspiracy. He almost died by poisoning in Egypt. He had the Saudi government allowed CIA agents to follow him around when he was at Hajj. He actually wrote about and talked about there were 2 white men who were following him around everywhere he was going, including in Mecca. So they let kuffar in to follow him. They followed him in Egypt. There was an attempt on his life in Egypt, and this was beyond the scope of what the Nation of Islam had power in. And even the Shabazz family said of the 3 people that were convicted of killing him, that they sternly said that 2 of them they believe were completely innocent, right? So I would just say that I would not blame the Nation of Islam for his murder. There's no proof that Elijah Muhammad ordered or orchestrated that. There's no evidence of that. But as far as where Malcolm was going, only Allah knows. His blessed ruh was taken at the time that it was appointed by Allah for a particular reason. Well, number one, I mean, that was the name that he picked. I don't know why, but you know, there are we have nonprofit statuses that are set up in America, and many times legally on paper they will have ink. It's called a 501c3 designation here in the States of having nonprofit status in order to get charity, being tax exempt, at least according to the American standard. In regards to incorporating, um, I mean, look, we live in non-Muslim lands and we should operate according to the laws of the lands, except when it goes against our fara'id. And in order to protect our organizations legally, I think it's best for them to be incorporated, especially when we're dealing with money and funds that, at least in America, in order to have a bank account of an organization, it has to be registered either as a business or a NGO. And to not do so, especially in America post 9/11, uh, it would be inviting um, prosecution by the government. So I mean, we have to do to protect ourselves. Is my position. If we're going to live in these lands, if we're going to make hijra back to the east, then or Muslim majority countries, then I mean that's different. But we have to do what we have to do while we're living here. So, as far as normative Islam being practiced, we know that the first Muslims um, that uh, were practicing Islam in America uh, openly after the Reconstruction period, is what's called, after the issue of legalized slavery in America, was basically immigrants that came from Surya Kubra, that came to America in the latter part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. They were only in certain areas, certain localities. Detroit was one of them. Um, the problem though is that with some of these places that where they established Maracas and Masajid in Iowa or in Michigan, is that the people who immigrated here, they immigrated here for the so-called American dream. They organized, they immigrated here to make money. And their concern wasn't about dawah. They had a nominal concern about preserving their culture and within that, preserving some of their religious heritage. But they had no interest in inviting the broader society to Islam, much less African Americans, because see, when many immigrants migrate to America, and especially at that time, people who are lighter skinned from Syria, from Lebanon, also people from Turkey who have light or white skin, then the American dream is based upon how white folks live, not how black folks live, right? So many people Angloize their names trying to pass. So the American dream at that time was to have you have a, um, a white house with a white picket fence, and that also means living next to white folks. So the closer you get to black folks, that's that impedes aspirational whiteness and social mobility. So the last thing that those Muslims wanted to do from the Beqa Valley in southern Lebanon, or from Tibnin or Bint Jbeil in southern Lebanon, or from Damascus or Istanbul, the last thing they wanted to do was to go amongst black people and start giving them dawah to come to their masajid. And God forbid if some of them became Muslim and asked to marry one of their daughters, right? So that's the haqiqah, that's the reality of America and the practice of normative Islam. And really, um, uh, the practice of normative Islam only began to grow more in America um, uh, after 1975, really. Besides some people who were immigrating from certain areas of the Muslim world, in particular Pakistan, and then some people who came later after the Civil War in Lebanon in the 80s. Well, I think that my message in general, and we're talking about Malcolm today. Malcolm, when he came from Hajj, he said, if white people studied Islam and applied it, this could help solve the race problem, right? So he was about dawah and about inviting people to learn about Islam, right? And not just an Islam that is aqli or theoretical, but amali, right? Like a practical demonstration of Islam. So for those who are not white, in particular who are Muslims who are watching this, that the challenge for us as Muslims is how can we embody the teachings, the spiritual teachings of Islam, and through a social practice of social egalitarianism that Islam preaches, and what our beloved prophet sought to institute with his companions during his lifetime. How can we actualize that so that we can show? I mean, firstly, so that we can be a community that's living uh, in accordance with what's pleasurable to Allah Azza wa Jal, but how can we as a community be a model towards the British people and towards the American people, societies that are steeped in the false ideology of white supremacy, who colonized much of the world, who are involved in neo-imperialism right now? Like, what can we do as a community to embody and show them a different way and call them towards a different way? So that's, I say that's my message, and that's our challenge. But if we're, I do say this, and I was asked a question about that was somewhat hypothetical about where would Malcolm be today, what his path. What I would say today, and Allah knows best, and forgive me if I'm wrong, if Malcolm X was alive today, many Muslims and many institutions would think he's too radical. They would think he's too racial, and they wouldn't invite him to be a speaker. They wouldn't invite him. They say he's too controversial. We want to keep safe. What about our so-called liberal or progressive friends or these people, right? We wouldn't invite him, right? So I think that that's also something that we have to really question. We have to question ourselves about. Allah knows best. Well, two things behind that. One, I think that Malcolm is such a, this is Hosn Dhan, this is putting a good opinion on some people, is that he's such a large figure that many people haven't even thought about his family or his wife and how much she contributed to his mission, and also what her accomplishments were after he passed away, right? So perhaps the light of Malcolm maybe is outshined Dr. Betty to a large degree. I think some of it also has to do straight up really with like misogyny and sexism, right? I think that many times in our communities we don't lift up uh, women heroes or religious or women leaders, right? Outside of looking back into medieval Islamic history. I mean, we'll talk about the Mawlid of Sayyidatuna Fatima Zahra, or talk about Zainab al-Kubra. Like we'll talk about them, but like those leaders amongst us right now who are women, I think it's a problem that we have. That's a broader problem than just Dr. Betty. Now, in regards to remembering her, we do this here in the States. So Malcolm X's birthday is in May, and it's a day called Malcolm X Day. What we have done in the States, and Dr. Betty is buried right next to Malcolm. So what we do is there's a large gathering there every year. It wasn't there last May because of COVID, but it's been going on for years. So the Pan-Africanists and all the other people come there. There's a ceremony honoring El Hajj Malik Shabazz and also Hajja, Dr. Betty Shabazz. And then once all the people who aren't Muslim leave, then we are at the graves of El Hajj Malik Shabazz and also Al Hajja Betty, and we read Quran on their behalf right there. So we read Al Fatiha and Yasin, and then we do a salawat, collective salawat and dua. So we do that every year at May. I hope with Allah's permission that I'm able to go there this May, but you can go online and Google it, and you can even see a video where I spoke there two years ago. But we honor Dr. Betty when we honor her husband at that event. I think what Malcolm said back then, his comparison to the conservative being like the wolf and the liberal being like the fox, I think that still is true this very day. His critique was brilliant. And so you may have heard it in some of his speeches, but he talks about, if you're a farmer and you have a chicken coop, you have to protect your chickens from the wolf and the fox. But he said that the fox is actually more dangerous than the wolf because the wolf howls, right? So you have time to go protect your chicken coop, whereas the fox is sneaky. You look at a fox, you can see its teeth, almost like it's smiling. But when your back is turned, the fox will eat your chickens. So he said that the so-called liberals are the foxes, and the so-called wolves, like Trump, that's a wolf. But and many times you put your guard down, and the fox will get you more. And I think it's true to this day. And I'm telling you, right now, personally, I'm concerned that the current president of the United States of America will probably start a new war in the Muslim world. Like Trump didn't do that. Trump didn't start a new war. He's a wolf. But you have these so-called liberals. And then these so-called liberals are the ones that make the greatest demands on us to compromise our deen, to compromise Islamic morality through LGBTQ agenda and some other things, right? Drugs. So it's just what Malcolm talked about back then in '64 and '65. It really hasn't changed, and I think that many American Muslims, anyway, spend too much time being overly consumed with national politics and giving money to national politics instead of focusing on local issues, local politics, and putting that money into dawah, right? That's my personal opinion. Bernie Sanders doesn't need my money. Who needs my money are the du'at and the people who are feeding homeless people, poor people, and calling them to the masjid and teaching them about the Prophet, teaching them about Ahlul Bayt, teaching them about the righteous Sahaba in our tradition. That's more important to me. Wallahu a'lam. Every year, there is an event on Malcolm X Day in May, and in Harlem, New York, there is what's called the Malcolm X Dr. Betty Shabazz Center. So it's the old Autobahn Theater where El Hajj Malik Shabazz was martyred. That was bought, and it was turned into a cultural/community center. So every year there is an event there on Malcolm X Day and his birthday. And Ilyasa Shabazz, his daughter, is the one that normally presides over that event every year, and it's normally live streamed. But if you ever have a chance to come to the States and come after COVID-19 is over, there's a wealth of history, just if you came to Harlem, New York, as far as African American history, but also history as it relates to Islam in America. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of Muslims that live in Harlem, by the way, from not just African Americans, but people from Senegal, Mali, Nigeria. May Allah help our brothers and sisters in Nigeria that are going through so much fitna right now. So yeah, Harlem would be a good place for you to come. So maybe next year in May 2022, maybe you can come to Malcolm X Day, join us for Ziyara, and then you can come and meet Malcolm X's daughters. But Ilyasa is the one who leads that up every year. Well, one of the biggest issues as far as his legacy is the amount of people who have been interested and came to Islam by reading his autobiography. I know several people who became interested in Islam and converted to Islam by reading his autobiography, and not just African Americans. I know white Americans, prominent white Americans, who have said that reading his autobiography was a bridge to Islam, and that's a very common narrative, at least in the States. So that book has been a murshid for many people to Islam. I can give you two prominent names, for instance, in the States. You may have heard of them. They're both Maliki scholars, but Sheikh Suhaib Webb, who's a white American, and Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah. Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah embraced Islam, I believe, in 1969, like a university, from reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, a white man, in the 60s. Sheikh Suhaib embraced Islam, and it was through reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. So I think that's one of his greatest, there's no telling how many people who got interested in learning about Islam through reading that autobiography. There's no telling how many people that's the case.